Hello again. So I wanted to do one more video about the last book that I read when it comes to like health and wellness and fitness and all of that. And that is the book Breath, The New Science of Lost Art by James Nestor. And it was an excellent book. This was probably my favorite of the books that I read over the summer. It was just super interesting. It was all about breathing and how to breathe properly. And he goes through how him and this other guy did an experiment where they mouth breathed they plugged their noses to make sure that like no air could get in their noses, and they mouth breathed for I think 2 weeks, and then like they took their vitals and all of that, and they looked at blood markers and all kinds of things periodically over those 2 weeks, and then they took the plugs out and switched to just nose breathing for the following 2 weeks to see like how things went. And so long story short, don't mouth breathe. And I found it super, super interesting about how they talked about how breathing actually doesn't regulate oxygen in your system. It regulates CO2 in your system, because you always kind of have, unless something's going really wrong, you always pretty much have the same amount of oxygen. But depending on how you're breathing, your CO2 levels can be different. And this book kind of claims that most people don't have enough CO2 in their systems because we breathe either too fast and too shallow or too fast and too deep. We don't have, most people don't breathe like a steady in and out without filling their lungs, or they breathe up here instead of down here, and that kind of. So it was just really, really, really interesting book. My favorite little tidbit of information from it, and I think I had actually heard this somewhere else before. It's not completely new, but it kind of talks about how it works, is that so fat, when you lose fat, when you burn it off, you actually lose most of that fat. 80% of it, and this is true, look it up, 80% of that fat is breathed out. It's converted into CO2 and breathed out. And the rest of it, the other 20%, is lost through sweat and stuff. But yeah, so 80% of the fat that you lose is breathed out. So breathing is very important. And I think, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like the foot book that I read, how we kind of ignore our feet, but they're the basis for kind of all of our movement. Breathing is kind of one of those things too, where we don't think about it. We don't put any thought into it. We just breathe. And most of us are breathing kind of wrong, and maybe we should think about how we're breathing. And how breathing really leads to better health, because when they were just mouth breathing and nothing else changed, they didn't change their diet was the same, their activity level was the same, everything was the same. Both of these guys that did this and obviously it's a very small sample size, but both of them developed horrendous sleep apnea, started snoring when neither of them had snored before. All of their vitals got worse. They felt crappy. They couldn't exercise as well. And then when they went to nasal breathing, all of that stuff within like the 2 week time frame kind of went back to normal. They stopped apneaing. Their apnea stopped at night. They stopped snoring for the most part. They, all this stuff kind of went away. All of their blood pressure went back to normal because their blood pressure had heightened. So all these things. So I found it like super, super interesting. And then he talks a lot about meditative breathing practices and the different ways that people meditate and the different ways that people breathe when they do so. And he also, the other one little like super interesting factoid is that he goes into how all around the world, all of these different religious practices, their prayers take the same amount of time. Their prayers are like 5.5 seconds in, breath, 5.5 seconds out, breath. And there's about 5 breaths per minute. And that seems to be like the most calming, like, I don't want to say best, but way to breathe. And all, it's just interesting that all of these different religions throughout the world, and he names like basically all the major religions, have this same pattern for when they do their prayers or their meditations. So I found that pretty interesting. So it's a really interesting, like you'd think it'd be dry, but it's not dry at all. I found myself just wanting to like read more and more. I found myself kind of hooked on it. The writing was really good and kept me interested. And then at the end, he has in one of the appendices, or in the appendix, he goes through all of the breathing methods that he talks about and tells you exactly how to do it. Because as I was reading it, I was like, I want to know how to do that. Like he kind of describes it, but then he doesn't really go into it. He just kind of tells you like what he got out of it and how it felt and that kind of thing, but he doesn't like tell you how to do it exactly. And I was like, wow, I want to know how to do it. But then at the very end of the book, in the appendix, he does list all of the breathing, all of the methods that he tried and used and how to go through them. And the other thing that, it was just full of such fun facts. And the other thing is that people, especially in Western society, we mouth breathe so much that it has actually changed the shape of our skulls, of our mouths, and our nasal passages, and our sinuses, and that's just super interesting. And that you can actually change it back. Like if you start breathing correctly, if you start nasal breathing and holding your jaw correctly, you can actually build bone. Like our jaws are all narrow, and he goes into that like being the reason for people not being able to fit wisdom teeth, having to have wisdom teeth pulled and all of that. It's super interesting. I don't know if that's definitely the reason why like wisdom teeth are always pulled, but then he goes into how when people start doing the things like breathing through their nose, chewing more, holding their jaws the way they should, then they actually build bone in that area, and things get better. So it was just really super interesting. I highly recommend this book, Breath. And just a completely different take on breathing. Like, because I've meditated, I've done some breath work, I've, done something, but I've never had it explained quite like this book explains it. So check it out. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the like button, share it, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you probably tomorrow with another video, not book related. So, bye.